Welcome to our virtual iHeart Science Festival. Today's theme is tiny creatures, and we will soon be joined by HannahGavin and Wendy Dirchu-Holzer to tell us all about tardigrades. Hi, Hannah. Hi, Wendy. Welcome. HannahGavin is the program manager at the Microbial Sciences Initiative, and Wendy Dirchu-Holzer is the director of the Harvard Museum of Natural History's Education Department. Wendy will be showing us some live tardigrades using one of the museum's microscopes, and Hannah will be telling us all about them and answering your questions. All right, take it away, Hannah and Wendy.
Hi, thanks so much. I'm excited to look at some tardigrades with you today, Wendy.
Exactly. Thank you, Ariel, for introducing us. Hannah, why don't you start us off then?
Sure. So, as I'm sure many of you are thinking about during this whole iHeart Science Festival, life consists of so many different types of creatures. Thinking about the diversity we see in the macroscopic or large-scale world, I think about maybe a family dog or cat or hamster, or a penguin that I would see at the zoo, maybe a sparrow flying around my neighborhood, or even the bones of a long dead dinosaur that you might see on display at the museum. And amazingly, just as much living diversity, in fact, even more, exists among the tiniest of living creatures, the microbes. So there are microbes that swim through the ocean, and microbes that make bread, and microbes that make dirt smell like dirt, and microbes that help generate the oxygen in our atmosphere. So today, Wendy and I are using a microscope to look at one very charismatic microbe, the tardigrade. So I would like to lead us off with a poll question because we want to hear from you about what you have read or know, whether you've read or even maybe seen tardigrades.
So go ahead and select. Maybe you're practically besties with the tardigrades. Maybe you've seen them on movies or TV shows. Maybe you kind of know something about them, but you have a lot of questions. Or maybe you're like, what are you talking about? Let's
see. So we have a few folks who are besties with tardigrades. Excellent. And let's see, some people, I know they've been showing up in a lot of movies and TV shows recently. I was talking with Wendy about that a little bit earlier. And some people, maybe you've heard of them, but are coming in with a lot of questions. That's great. We'll get to talk about some of those in a little bit. And for some folks, this is going to be a first experience. That's going to be really cool. All right. So fortunately, I think Wendy might be able to show us a tardigrade.
What do you think? Is this what you all were expecting? This is our stuffed animal. But Hannah, you and I like to look at this one. Why? What do you like about seeing this?
I think the stuffed one is great because even though it's much bigger and probably cuddlier than the real life version, looking at this version helps us to understand and orient us to what we're going to see looking through the microscope in a little bit. So this stuffed tardigrade has a couple of features that are actually maybe a little bit familiar. It has legs. In this case, it has 8 legs. At the ends of those legs, it has some appendages, little claws or toe-looking things. It comes with a few different body segments that are divided by some stitching in this version. And then it has eyes and eye spots there. So those are some things that are even familiar to us from animals we might have already seen. And now we're going to get a chance to see them in microscopic version.
So like Hannah's saying, we do need to see it in microscopic version because this jar probably has 100, 300 different tardigrades in it. But of course, you're not going to see it. So let's switch over. I'm going to share my screen, which is connected to our microscope. And here we go.
Oh, cool. This is great. So, Wendy, can you tell me what sort of magnification we're using right now?
So my microscope, the piece that's coming down, is a 40 times higher. I believe that the camera adds another 10 times. So if you multiply that together, that should be 400 times. Is that right, Hannah?
Awesome. That sounds right to me. Yeah. So we're looking at these 400 times bigger than they actually are. And So let's take a look and just orient ourselves now to the tiny version. And I do just want to point out that as crazy as this may seem, this isn't a movie or an animation. This is what's actually happening in the water that Wendy's looking at live right now, which is extra exciting. So you might notice some little tiny things zooming around, and those are live too, but they're not the tardigrade. The tardigrade is where Wendy's mouse is right now, and it's the critter that's like the one we looked at bigger that is there. And so we can see some of the body parts actually that we just looked at in the bigger version. It's a similar shape, and when it's swimming around here, you can see its tiny legs, and you might see it also doing a little bit of crawling or mountain climbing, and it's on these clumps of algae. So algae is what this type of tardigrade uses for food. And so they're crawling around in these clumps of algae, and then sometimes they'll stop to eat a little bit of algae. And depending on the angle, we can also sometimes even see the algae in their stomach, because one big difference between these tardigrades and the stuffed animal that we looked at is that these don't have a blue color to them. They are pretty much see-through. So like that one at the bottom, the darker spot in the middle of the body, that's actually inside its gut. We can see into the tardigrade, into its gut, and see little bits of the algae that it's been eating.
So that's the food it's been eating, huh?
Mm-hmm.
And we're looking all the way through. That's kind of amazing.
Mm-hmm.
I like watching these guys because, like you're saying, I can see how the head is here. And when it turns just a little bit, I can see those two little eye spots.
Mm-hmm.
And I really see his little legs. Oh my, one is trying to climb over the other. Let's get on them.
They're interacting with each other right now. Yeah. So these are in water, as Wendy showed you, the little cup with water, and we sucked a bit of that water up to put on the microscope slide. So when they aren't among the algae, like this one that seems to be going downwards a little bit, it's just sort of swimming slowly through its aquatic environment. They aren't super good at walking when it's dry, but they do swim through the water and crawl along the algae there. These two seem to be sort of a similar size, Wendy, but I know that depending on the different tardigrade, depending on how old it is, and depending on the species of tardigrade, of which there are many, they can range in size pretty significantly. I was trying to think of a good comparison for that, and I think a pretty good one would be they're often the width of sort of a thicker human hair. And so they're really tiny. Obviously, that'd be hard to see any details without the microscope, and that's why we're looking at them 400 times bigger.
Well, I'm not sure if you're seeing this as well as I am, but there is a round circle right here. And then there's kind of a clear space around it.
I see that. Yeah, I think that what we might have going on there, and I think we're lucky in this spot that you're able to view, is actually a tardigrade egg. So these tardigrades are born from eggs that are laid and left behind. And often they're left behind in the exoskeleton of the tardigrade that has laid them. So probably what you're seeing there is an egg in the middle. That's going to be a developing tardigrade. And then the shadow around it, this sort of outline, is the exoskeleton from a tardigrade that laid that egg. It shed its outer layer, laid the egg as it was leaving, and then crawled away. And now, who knows, it might be one of those that we're seeing right now, or it might have crawled farther off and is in some other clump of algae somewhere else.
So Hannah, would you like me to look around the screen, or should we quiz our viewers again?
I think quizzing the viewers is a great idea. So now we've got another poll question for you. This one is about some of the common nicknames for tardigrades, and which of these is not a common nickname. We've got water bear, forest crab, moss piglet.
All right, folks, make your best guesses. What do you think?
I'm going to let you have a few minutes to guess. And while you're thinking about it, we're going to talk about what a tardigrade even is. So it's this tiny microscopic animal. And sometimes we call things that are microscopic, but also animals, microfauna. And that just means they're in this general category of things that are actually in the animal kingdom. What that means is that these tardigrades are more closely related to you and me than they are to some other types of microbes like the bacteria that we heard about earlier.
So should we get the results? Did we get to see that?
Yeah, let's look at the poll results. Oh, this is a pretty knowledgeable crowd. So you've decided that the one that is not a common nickname for tardigrades is the forest crab, and that is totally correct. So the first person to ever observe a tardigrade under the microscope thought that it looked like a small water bear. And that was actually before it had the name tardigrade. Someone looked at it and saw that it looked like a small aquatic bear. Now, eventually, someone else looked at it a few years later and named it tardigrade for slow walker. And as you can see, they're not exactly zipping across the screen, so that seems pretty accurate for slow walker. And they're in the water, thus the water part. That's where they were originally observed. But they're also very commonly found in mosses. They love mosses, whether that be on a rock, by a pond or a lake, or even the moss in gutters. And they have a little bit of a pig-like quality to them too, so they also became known as moss piglets.
I've decided that's my new favorite name for them because I like watching them wandering around this algae, which I imagine as moss, and they're kind of chewing their way through it.
Definitely, definitely. So not many people were tricked. Forest crab is not the name, but I do think one thing that's interesting is the animals that they're most closely related to are the arthropods, which includes things like insects and crustaceans. So in terms of their relatives, their animal relatives, they're pretty closely related to maybe to a crab, but in terms of what they look like to us and the things that are kind of familiar, they look a little more like a piglet or a bear, and they're often found in water and in moss. So I don't know about you, Wendy, I could definitely just keep talking about the tardigrades all day, and we have plenty more fun facts for you all, but I'd actually really love to know what you're curious about and what questions you have for us.
Wonderful. Thank you, Hannah and Wendy. And we have a lot of great questions. A few people are wondering about whether we have tardigrades in our drinking water. And if we do have them in our drinking water, is that something we should be concerned about?
That's a great question. A lot of our drinking water is treated with chemicals or filters that take out almost any microbe. So my first answer would be probably not. Fortunately, as someone who goes camping a lot by ponds or lakes or things like that, I have a feeling that I've probably accidentally ingested a tardigrade or two in my day, and they are not at all harmful or damaging to humans. That's great to know.
We're also wondering about what role tardigrades play in ecology, in where they live. What's their ecological niche, maybe?
Yeah. So my understanding of this is that they're really involved in turning over nutrients. And what I mean by that is that in our jar here, they're eating algae, and then they're digesting it and they're producing waste. And so it's involved in nutrient cycling in the many environments in which they live. And that may be in a marine environment, like a saltwater environment. That may be in a freshwater pond. It may be in a moist area next to the pond. And there's tons of cycling of nutrients that happens in all of those environments that maybe we don't necessarily see because it's happening at the microscopic level. And they're one of the many organisms that contribute to that.
And it sounds like from what you're saying that tardigrades can live in a lot of different kinds of water. So what sort of environments do we find them in?
That's a great question too. And there are almost 1,000 described species of tardigrades. Now, about 150 of those that we meaning scientists have observed are marine. They live in those salty environments. The rest are either considered freshwater, meaning you would scoop them out of a non-salty water source, or terrestrial. Now, even those terrestrial ones, the ones that are usually found on land, usually live near water or in a very moist type of land environment because they do need water to get around and to just keep their bodies hydrated.
So we were wondering also if they can live on land where it's dry.
They can live on land that we as large humans might consider dry, but they can't survive very long without enough water.
And could they move around on that dry land?
They could make their way sort of in a similar way to how we're seeing them crawl across the algae. They could crawl across small bits of dirt and sand. So they could make their way slowly, definitely. But it seems like they are pretty adapted to be near or in water.
Excellent. And do we know in this case in particular what kind of water they're in?
This is just fresh water. And Wendy, you can even, I know you need to take care of them when you're culturing them there at the lab.
And we just put very clean water in it, and we keep a stockpile of the moss, the algae growing in a separate container. Clearly, you can see there's a lot of things living in here, whether it's the tardigrades, the water bears, the moss piglets, or all these tiny one-celled animals as well.
Oh, so we didn't catch these ourselves, but if someone wanted to go find a tardigrade themselves, how could they do that?
I tried this a year ago. It was super exciting and a little frustrating. I literally went to my backyard and pulled up some moss. I put it upside down in a container with water for about a day to try and get them to drop out of it. And then afterwards, I stuck it underneath a microscope. And it was super exciting. I spent 20 minutes looking for a tardigrade. I found all sorts of other wiggly microscopic animals. And then I finally found one. It was so awesome.
Victory!
But a little frustrating until that point.
Yeah, we're lucky in that what we're looking at today, these tardigrades were grown by scientists, and so we could get them in this sort of concentrated culture. When you're hunting them on your own, which people definitely do, I know another volunteer from the museum who has found them from moss in her gutter. They're there, they're just a little more rare and a little less concentrated, so it takes a little time and a little patience like Wendy exhibited.
I also know that on the internet are a lot of tips about how to try and catch my tardigrade. Mm-hmm. For me, I think the limiting factor is, do you have a microscope that you can see it in?
Fair enough. So we also have a lot of questions about tardigrades being amazing survivors. And someone said they heard that tardigrades can lay eggs in space and survive in acid or even years without water. And is this true?
It is true. And this is one of the things that made tardigrades sort of famous among scientists, famous amongst lots of people, because we got wind of the fact that these microscopic animals, which are so charming, also have what we might consider some superpowers. And so the main strategy that they use to survive a lot of these extreme conditions that you've mentioned, or that others of you may have heard about: extreme temperatures, extreme dryness, extreme pressure, UV radiation from space. They can survive and withstand that using this extreme form of hibernation. That is, there are a few different terms for it: cryptobiosis, anabiosis. Basically what this means is they're able to dehydrate themselves and almost stop their metabolism. So it's almost like they aren't living at all. They're using very little oxygen, very little energy and calories, and they essentially just go into this dehydrated state, which is called a TUN, T-U-N. And in that state, they can withstand so many challenges that certainly our human bodies and a lot of other critters cannot withstand. And so that's what allows them to perform these incredible feats, including being sent to space, including laying eggs in space.
Wow. So if they're such good survivors, can they be killed?
Yes, that's the natural counterpart to that question, right? Classic. So what I've just told you about this extreme form of hibernation, that if they're in that state the whole time, we know they can survive from that, in that state, even up to 30 years frozen, and then rehydrate back to life once they've been put back in water at a normal temperature, and go on about their business as though the past 30 frozen years hadn't happened. But the way you see them here, they're moving around, they're eating, they're growing, they're reproducing. In this full life state, their normal lifespan is about 3 to 30 months, depending on the species. So they will eventually, just like other types of animals, they'll get older and they'll eventually die of old age. But I read a quote from a tardigrade studying scientist, and she said, if they can get into the ton state, they can survive pretty much anything.
Oh, that's interesting. So they have to get into that state first before they're able to survive all of these different environments. Interesting. We also had some questions about tardigrades reproduction. Are there male and female tardigrades? How do they reproduce?
That's a great question, and one that we sort of got to hint at seeing that egg earlier. So this depends a little bit on the species. Some species of tardigrades have male and female tardigrades, and they reproduce sexually. They're eggs from the female and sperm from the male, and those come together and produce fertilized eggs that eventually develop into new tardigrades. Other species of tardigrades reproduce asexually. That means one is able to lay eggs that develop into a new tardigrade all on their own. Or maybe they fertilize the eggs themselves and those develop too. So it really depends on the species. But either way, you end up with eggs, and those tiny tardigrades develop inside the egg, and then they chew their way out at the end.
Oh, wow. So do tardigrades have any predators? Are there things out there that are eating the tardigrades?
Definitely. Some other, basically things that are slightly bigger than the tardigrades are. And in some cases, even tardigrades eating some species of tardigrades eating other tardigrades. But you can imagine that there are tiny insects and other things for which the tardigrades are looking like a pretty good food source.
So some people are also wondering, on our screen here, if we zoomed out, would we be able to see more tardigrades? Are there others elsewhere that we're just not seeing right now?
So first of all, you saw me kind of moving around the screen. I will go ahead and switch to our zoomed out view. That's not that zoomed out, it's a little bit more. But I do have what's called a depression slide, or a little well. It's got a little cup. And as I scroll around the screen, whenever I find one of those clumps, oops, I'm at the edge there. Whenever I find one of those clumps of algae, there's a decent chance I might find some tardigrades. Not every clump seems to have some, right? I don't see anybody active there, but I'd spend some time looking to see what sort of variety we can find around here.
And we still have some people who are wondering if tardigrades can be dangerous. Are they dangerous to people in any way?
No, I think the only things they're dangerous to are the things they're using for a food source. So if you're a prey of a tardigrade, like the algae in this case, or like some of the other microscopic organisms that they eat, maybe the little zoomies in here, I don't actually know. But then in that case, they'd be dangerous. But in terms of a human being exposed to tardigrades, nope, not dangerous.
Excellent. And going along with that, someone was wondering, what else do they eat besides algae?
They eat other small, so for example, protists are another type of microorganism that they might eat. Some of them are herbivores, meaning they eat mostly plant cells, and others are omnivores or carnivores, meaning they'll eat other types of microscopic worms or, like I said, other tardigrades. So it depends a little bit on the species, but mostly other tiny types of cells, other things that would be microscopic, whether that's an algae cell or a plant cell, or maybe a eukaryotic single cell organism.
And we've been talking about these little zoomy things zooming around. Do we know what they are?
I don't know exactly. So there's a couple good guesses that I have just based on how they're zooming around. It looks like it's just one cell. Now look at one thing I like here. the tardigrade may be tiny, but you can see how big it is compared to the other organisms. So the one that we're seeing zoom fast, swimming around the tardigrade, that's just made up of one cell. And it's living its life sort of autonomously, whereas the tardigrade's made up of about 1,000 cells. And you can see how giant it looks in comparison. But no, this is some sort of single-celled organism, maybe a protist. There's one called a euglena that tends to swim around like that. But I have to be honest in that I'm not totally sure. It's a little hard to tell just from here, and we'd have to look at them using some different types of microscopes and maybe even look at their DNA if we wanted to know some more of the details.
And what's fascinating to me is, I don't know if you'd said this, Hannah, but there's like 1,000 different species of tardigrades, right?
There are. Mm-hmm.
Just like you can say there are birds in the world.
Yes.
But you want to talk specifically about cardinals or something like that. There's a whole bunch of species of tardigrades. So the place that I purchased these tardigrades don't even send us the name of the species. They send us a little bit more detail about what group it's from, but we don't even have a species name for these.
And the different species, it's pretty neat. They differ in the appendages that are at the end of their legs. Some of them have more like little suction pads. Some of them have these claw-like appendages, and they differ a little bit in their color. These are pretty see-through, and a lot of them are, but there are some that have more of a redder shell. And that depends a little bit on their environment and on what they eat, and whether they're eating things that allow them to be pigmented too.
Excellent. And I think we might have time for one more question. I think this is an interesting one to think about. How can tardigrades contribute to scientific advancement?
I think one of the reasons that scientists are studying them is to understand how they're so resilient to so many conditions, and what signals they use to know, oh, I need to go into this ton state, or I need to come out of this ton state. And not that that's something we as humans would be able to replicate. I don't know that we're going to be able to become tons anytime soon. But the fact that their DNA is so protected against UV radiation, for example, while they're in the ton state, is something that maybe we could learn about protecting our own DNA from damages.
Wow. Excellent. Well, thank you, Hannah and Wendy. I think that's all the time we have for questions today.
Thank you so much.
Sure.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks again for joining us today, and have a great day, everyone.